All right, everyone, welcome to chapter 9. And this chapter really marks this sort of moment where the U.S. withdraws completely from European affairs for the most part and really focuses on internal issues, internal expansion and internal debate and even internal conflict. And so the remainder of the chapters in History 1301 are really going to be about the U.S. And not focusing a whole lot on U.S. relations with foreign powers because we really limit ourselves as far as having relations with foreign powers. And in chapter 9, we're really going to talk about expansion, both physically, expanding westward, but also the expansion of the American economy and how America does business and how it develops. And so that's going to be the focus of this particular chapter. All right, so the first thing we'll talk about is actually physical expansion into Western territories. Americans moved west in a sort of series of bursts. It wasn't a continuous influx of people into the West. The first burst of Western movement happened after 1791, where the first settlers began to make their way across the Appalachian Mountains. And this is when we see four new states come into the Union: Vermont, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. The expansion we're talking about in this first spurt is expansion into the Northwest Territory that we acquired following the Revolutionary War. And it pretty much was established by the time we hit the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century. The second burst of American westward expansion happened in the kind of early 19th century, around 1815, 1820. And this was movement from beyond the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. And in this burst, you get the addition of states like Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri. Even as states like Indiana and Illinois were gaining statehood, you also have settlers pouring into even more westerly territories, places like Michigan. Ohio's population jumps up from about 45,000 in 1800 to roughly 581,000 by 1820. Pioneers usually migrated as families rather than individuals, especially in these early spurts, and most of them clustered near the navigable rivers in the western territories, especially the systems created by the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Migrants to the West often also brought with them the values and customs that were particular to the regions that they left behind, and they usually made lateral moves. So, migrants from New England or upstate New York would settle in northern territories in the West, like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and they also brought their practices with them. They would grow wheat and raise dairy and grow fruit orchards and those kind of things. They also had the same sort of values. They valued public schools. They lived in houses made of sod or stone or clapboard, and also very quickly formed into towns. Going further south, immigrants that came from the upland South moved into the southern parts of those same states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, where they tend to focus their livelihood on raising corn and hogs. And they also tended to live in log cabins and on isolated farm sort of homesteads rather than in towns or cities. Slower to form, because it was slower to form rather towns and cities, in these areas, public schools were also less apparent in these areas as well. And although some of these settlers, typically called butternutters, because of the color of their clothing. They're rather homespun fabrics that they made their clothing out of. Although some of them, like for instance Abraham Lincoln's father, opposed slavery, many more of them supported it. And there was very little love lost between the anti-slavery Yankees who populated the northern portions of these western states and the pro-slavery Butternuts who populated the southern portions of these same states. Regardless of their origins, though, most Westerners craved some form of social contact. Rural families would join in with their neighbors in group sporting events and festivities. Men would meet for games that tested their strength or agility, like wrestling. And some of these games could get particularly brutal. Women also would combine to do housework and to play at quilting and sewing parties and other things that were social. But some social activities often also brought the genders together. They would have dances and other sort of get-togethers that allowed for people to intermingle. Before 1840, very few Westerners could afford any kind of elegant living, and the lack of refinement also led a lot of people on the East Coast to label them as backward or, redneck, or I suppose at least the early 19th century version of redneck in the way that we use it today. They're very much easy targets for contempt because of that. Westerners responded to this kind of contempt by saying that at least they were honest Democrats and not soft would-be aristocrats like the growing urban populations of the East. They showed very little tolerance for social pretensions in the West generally. And it kind of explains why Western politicians also tended to be a little bit more rough around the edges, with probably the quintessential example being Andrew Jackson. Excuse me. Exploration in the far west, so this is the portion of the Louisiana Purchase which would be the kind of Midwest for us today, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, those sorts of territories way out there. Exploration there was definitely halting in nature. You had some rather well-known explorers who made their way into the far west. People like Zebulon Pike, who explored the Spanish Southwest in 1806 when he sighted a peak in Colorado, which was later named after him, and that is Pikes Peak today. You also have some who went to the far west for profit. People like the New York merchant John Jacob Astor founded a fur trading post named Astoria after himself at the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon, and basically built his fortune off of that. At first, whites relied very heavily on Native Americans to bring them furs, as fur trading was the main source of income in the far west part of the United States. But during the 1820s, you have trappers, mountain men like Kit Carson or Jim Bridger, who would go and gather the furs for themselves instead of having to trade with the Native Americans for them. The most important cause of expansion to the Mississippi from 1790 to 1840 was the growing strength of the federal government. The federal government directly stimulated settlement in the western territories by promising land to men who enlisted during the War of 1812. And a lot of former soldiers and their families pulled up roots and moved west after that war was concluded. In order to facilitate that westward migration, Congress authorized funds in 1816 for the extension of the National Road, a highway which began in 1811 and reached Wheeling, Virginia on the Ohio River, and in 1818 was extended into Vandalia, Illinois by 1838. And very soon, it was populated by settlers who were heading to Western territories. The same government power that aided the whites also served to bring misery to the Native Americans, as virtually all of the foreign policy successes during the eras of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe worked to the disadvantage of Native Americans. In the stalemate that ended the War of 1812, the only real losers were, in fact, the Native Americans, as early on in the negotiations leading to the Treaty of Ghent, the British had insisted on the creation of an Indian buffer state between the U.S. and Canada in the Old Northwest, but the British eventually abandoned that idea and left that land open for the rather land-hungry Americans. And so even their former allies, the British, couldn't really be counted on in that regard either. As white settlers moved west, they encountered sizable numbers of Native Americans, and particularly in the South, it was the home to the so-called 5 civilized tribes that mainly were in the states of places like Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and that area around there. These tribes consisted of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole tribes. Years of commercial dealings as well as intermarriage with various white settlers had created in these tribes, especially in the Cherokee, an influential minority who embraced a lot of white European customs, such as Christianity, agricultural, gristmill, and some of them even owned slaves. The civilization of southern tribes impressed New England missionaries more so than their closest neighbors, Southerners, who viewed them with contempt and most especially wanted the land that they were occupying. James Monroe and John Quincy Adams, as presidents, concluded several treaties with the tribes which provided for their voluntary removal to public lands west of the Mississippi. Although some assimilated mixed bloods sold their tribal lands to the government, and others resisted their property or their prosperity, rather, being dependent on the trade with neighboring white settlers. Full-blooded tribesmen, with the majority of them, even in the civilized tribes, clung very desperately to their traditional customs as well as their land that they lived on. And so this led to a conflict with the federal government, one that the tribes were ultimately doomed to lose. During the 1820s, whites in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi intensified the pressure on the tribes by surveying tribal lands and squatting on them, just sort of setting up houses and places to live. Southern legislatures were very reluctant to restrain these settlers, and so moved to expropriate the tribal lands themselves, unless the tribes moved on and into the West. State laws extended jurisdiction over the tribes and effectively outlawed any kind of tribal government. These measures were acceptable and even exciting for the former Indian fighter Andrew Jackson when he got into office as president. He was reared on the frontier and believed that the tribes should not be treated as independent nations, but rather subject to the laws of whatever state they occupied. And this position basically spelled doom for the tribes. In 1830, he secured the passage of the Indian Removal Act, which authorized him to exchange public lands in the West for territories in the East. The act appropriated roughly $500,000 to cover the expenses of the removal, but the real costs, in both human costs as well as monetary, were far greater than the $500,000 that was appropriated. The federal government forced the tribes to exchange roughly 100 million acres of their lands they owned in the East for only a fraction of the same amount, roughly 32 million acres of public lands in the West. So they definitely took a loss on that exchange. Ironically, the Cherokee, who were often considered the most civilized of the civilized tribes, suffered probably the worst fate. In 1827, the tribe proclaimed itself an independent republic and petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court for an injunction against the state of Georgia's assertion that state jurisdiction was superior to theirs. In the case of the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall denied the Cherokees' claim to the status as a republic and identified them instead as a domestic dependent within the United States. However, Marshall added that their prolonged occupancy of the territory had given the Cherokee a legitimate claim to their land within Georgia. Later, in another case brought before the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia, he further clarified the position of the Cherokee tribe by holding that they were a distinct political community and entitled to federal protection from Georgia's claims. Jackson was not impressed by this ruling, and it was reported that he said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." And he basically just ignored the ruling and allowed Georgia to do whatever they wanted. Federal agents then persuaded some minor Cherokee chiefs to sign a treaty which ceded all of the Cherokee lands in the United States for the price of about $5.6 million and free passage west. Congress then ratified this treaty despite the fact that a majority of the Cherokee denounced it. And in fact, Congress only ratified the treaty by a single vote. In 1838, the Cherokee were removed by force to the new Indian Territory in what is now the state of Oklahoma. They traveled west along what became known as the Trail of Tears because of the miserable conditions that they were forced to endure. They traveled this trail in the winter, a rather harsh winter. Most of them were poorly prepared for it, and a good number of them died as a result of the removal. Tribes living in the Northwest Territory didn't do much better, as a series of treaties managed to extinguish the land titles that they owned, and most of them were forced to move west of the Mississippi. You also have a large expansion, as I mentioned before, of America's economy in general. After the War of 1812, the rising prices of agricultural commodities like wheat, corn, and cotton sharpened the land hunger that drove a lot of white settlement to the Western territories, and several factors accounted for the skyrocketing farm prices. During the Napoleonic Wars, the United States very quickly captured former British markets in the West Indies and former Spanish markets in South America. And after the wars ended, American farmers found a very brisk demand for their wheat and corn in Britain and France itself, both of whom were exhausted by a fairly solid 2 decades of warfare. In addition to that, demand within the United States for Western farm commodities intensified after 1815 as industrialization in the Northeast and urbanization that followed it drew workers into non-agricultural employment. The West's extraordinary river systems also made it possible for farmers to ship their wheat and corn downriver to New Orleans much more easily than they could overland to eastern markets. And from there, they would either sell the goods or ship them on to markets further afield. As the prospect of raising wheat and corn pulled eastern farmers towards the Old Northwest, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 stimulated the settlement of the Old Southwest, particularly areas like Alabama and Mississippi. As cotton clothing came into fashion around 1815, the British textile industry provided an almost inexhaustible demand for raw cotton, which the southern United States was very happy to supply. A lot of farmers traditionally grew only enough food to feed their families and engage in small-scale local exchange with any surplus they had. But a growing number of farmers were now adding a cash crop to participate in the emerging market economy that dominated the United States. In the South, slaves became an increasingly valuable commodity, and the sale of slaves that was declining from agricultural states in the Southeast to planters and farmers migrating to the Southwest grew into a huge business. For example, states like Virginia and North Carolina are now largely becoming states that provide slaves for plantations in the lower South that grow cotton. And so you could almost say that their business is in fact the breeding of slaves rather than agriculture itself. The unprecedented scale of commercial agriculture after 1815 exposed a lot of farmers to new risks. Farmers themselves had no real control over the prices in distant markets, and even more so as time went on, or lapsed between harvesting a cash crop and selling it, farmers were quite often forced to borrow money in order to sustain their families. So therefore, the market economy was forcing a lot of farmers into short-term debt in order to pursue long-term profit. In addition, a lot of Western farmers were also having to borrow money just to buy the land to work. Partisan and sectional pressures also buffeted federal land policy. Early federal land policy attempted to ensure the orderly settlement of the public domain, and to this end you have things like the Ordinance of 1785, which divided up public lands into sections, and the Northwest Ordinance, which provided a method for those places to become states. This assumed that farmers who shared ties based on religion or geographic origin would band together to purchase sections. The sections were normally rather large, about 640 acres. The goal was then for compatible settlers to live on adjoining lots in what would amount to rural neighborhoods, thus making the task of government in those territories easier. Political developments in the 1790s, however, undermined those expectations. The Federalists, who were based largely in the East, were reluctant to encourage Western settlement, but still eager to raise the revenue for the federal government from land sales. And so they reconciled these conflicting goals by encouraging the sale of huge tracts to wealthy speculators, who would then wait for land values to rise and sell off smaller parcels to individual farmers. Convinced that the small farmer was the backbone of the Republic, Jefferson and the Republicans took a different tact when they got into office. Their land law of 1800 dropped the minimum purchase to 320 acres from 640, and it dropped the price. By 1832, the minimum purchase had shrunk even further to 40 acres, and the price as well had shrunk even further. Although Congress steadily liberalized federal land policy, speculators always remained one step ahead of the federal government itself. Before 1832, speculators were already selling 40-acre plots of land to farmers. All the land in the public domain was also sold at auction, usually for much more than the minimum price set by law. With agricultural prices soaring, speculators assumed that land would continue to rise in value and were willing to bid high amounts on new land, which they would then resell to farmers for profit. The growing availability of credit following the War of 1812 also encouraged this kind of speculation. The chartering of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816 increased the amount of money in circulation, and between 1812 and 1817, the value of all the banknotes in circulation soared from $45 million to roughly $100 million. Stockholders and officers saw banks as agencies that could lend them money for land speculation, and the result was a frenzy of land speculation that ultimately resulted in a financial panic and collapse. Despite the dominant role played by speculators, most of the public domain eventually found its way into the hands of small farmers. The activities of the speculators were also constrained by the familiar frontier figure called the squatter. Even before the creation of public domain, squatters had simply helped themselves to Western land. They tended to be a rather independent and proud lot, and scornful of their fellow citizens, who they usually saw as softened by ease and affluence and luxury that can be had in eastern cities. But the group most hated by squatters was speculators. Squatters formed claims associations in order to monitor auctions and prevent speculators from bidding up land prices. They also pressured Congress to allow them preemption rights, that is, the right to purchase at a minimum price the land that they had already settled on and improved. Congress responded by passing special preemption laws for squatters in certain areas, and finally acknowledged a general right of preemption in 1841. But these preemption laws were of no use to farmers who arrived after the speculators had already bought up the land. These people had to buy land from the speculators on credit at interest rates that could be as high as 40%. Countless farmers who had carried basically conservative expectations to the West quickly became economic risk takers, and many would work their acreage to exhaustion and then move on in search of new land. Not only did this shift the line of settlement further west with each passing decade, but the same people quite often moved repeatedly. The land boom ultimately collapsed in financial panic in what is known as the Panic of 1819. Loose financial practices of the state banks contributed significantly to this panic. A lot of state banks would issue their own banknotes, which were promises to pay the bearer a certain amount of specie on demand. The state banks had long issued far more banknotes than they could ever hope to redeem, and it was these notes that fueled the land boom after 1815. The farmers also borrowed to buy more land and plant more crops, and then planned to repay their loans by selling their crops to Europe. But after 1817, the combination of bumper crops in Europe and a recession in Britain trimmed that foreign demand for U.S. products, and it severely hurt farmers' abilities to pay back their loans. By the summer of 1818, reacting to that uncontrolled flood of state banknotes, the Federal Bank of the United States began to insist that state banks offer specie to redeem notes that were now held by the Bank of the United States. When the bank ultimately demanded redemption in specie of all the state banknotes that they held, the state banks had to force farmers and land speculators to repay all of the loans that they had borrowed. The result was a cascade of economic catastrophe. The biggest losers were the land speculators themselves. Land that had once sold for as much as $69 an acre now plummeted to $2 an acre. And land prices fell because the credit squeeze drove down the market prices of staples like wheat, corn, cotton, and tobacco. The panic left behind a rather bitter public animosity toward banks in general, and in particular the Bank of the United States, which was widely blamed for the hard times. The panic also demonstrated just how dependent farmers had become on distant markets, and one response was the acceleration of the search for better and cheaper ways to get the crops to market. And this ultimately led to a revolution in transportation. Without major changes in the transportation network, the market economy would remain local and regional rather than national. And in the early decades of the 19th century, Americans began to address this problem, and in doing so initiated that transportation revolution. In 1807, Robert R. Livingston and Robert Fulton introduced the steamboat, named the Clermont, on the Hudson River. They soon gained a monopoly from the New York legislature to run a ferry service between New York and New Jersey. And spectacular profits lured competitors who secured a license from Congress and then filed a suit to break up the Livingston-Fulton monopoly. This lawsuit eventually came before the Supreme Court in the case of Givens versus Ogden. And in that decision, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled, or rather stated, that the court ruled Congress's constitutional power to regulate interstate commerce applied to navigation and thus had to prevail over New York's power to license and monopoly. In the aftermath of that decision, other state-granted monopolies began to collapse, and steamboat traffic increased rapidly on the river systems. Steamboats very quickly assumed a vital role along the Mississippi and Ohio river systems. Before the coming of the steamboat, the keel boat, which was a sort of flat barge-like boat that was pushed along using either poles or oars, ruled in the western rivers, but it would take 3 or 4 months to complete the voyage from New Orleans to Louisville, Kentucky. A steamboat, however, could make the same trip in just 25 days. The development of long, shallow hulls also enabled steamboats to navigate the Mississippi-Ohio system even when the river levels dropped during the summer. In order to compete for passengers, steamboats began to offer luxurious cabins and lounges called saloons. While steamboats were proving their value, canals were starting to replace roads and turnpikes as the focus of investment for infrastructure. These offered a prospect of connecting the Mississippi and Ohio river systems with the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes in turn to eastern markets in places like New York or Philadelphia. Constructed between 1817 and 1825, the Erie Canal, which connected Lake Erie with New York, or the Hudson River rather, enabled produce from Ohio to reach New York City along a continuous stretch of waterways. Completion of the canal started a canal boom during the late 1820s and 1830s. However, when another economic depression hit in the late 1830s, a lot of states responded by scrapping the rather costly canal projects. As the canal boom ended, an entirely new form of transportation was introduced, and that was the railroad. In 1825, the world's first commercial railroad began operating in England, and by 1840, Americans had laid about 3,000 miles of track. The railroads had obvious advantages over canals. They were far cheaper to build and achieved faster speeds than canal boats. They also were able to reach far more places. However, the potential of the railroads was only very slowly realized. Most early railroads ran between cities in the east, rather than from east to west, and most carried passengers rather than freight. There are two factors that explain the relatively slow spread of interregional railroads. First, unlike the canals, which were built by state governments, most railroads were constructed by private corporations and sought quick profits. In order to minimize their original investment, railroad companies also resorted to a number of cost-cutting measures, such as covering wooden rails with iron bars, which were prone to breaking. As a result, American railroads, though relatively cheap to build, proved to be very expensive to maintain, in direct contrast to canals, which, while they were expensive to build, were very cheap to maintain. A second reason for the slow spread of interregional railroads was that canal prices for shipping bulky commodities like iron or coal, or non-perishable commodities like agricultural produce, remained far lower than the prices you could find on the railroads. The transportation revolution also sped the growth of towns and cities, with the most rapid urbanization in American history occurring between 1820 and 1860. The Erie Canal turned New York City into the nation's largest, and cities and towns began to grow up generally with dramatic speed, especially in the western territories. Western cities were commercial hubs rather than manufacturing centers, and most were flooded with people who were eager to make money. The transportation revolution selected some cities for growth while sentencing others to relative decline. The completion of the Erie Canal shifted the center of Western economic activity from the river cities towards Great Lakes cities like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, and Milwaukee. Industrialization also gave an added boost to the growth of cities and towns. The U.S. generally lagged behind by roughly a generation behind European powers like Britain. And Britain was attempting to maintain their lead by banning the immigration of skilled mechanics. So, when Samuel Slater, who had a thorough knowledge of British cotton spinning technology, immigrated to the U.S. in 1789, he passed himself off as a farm laborer instead of a mechanic. The following year, he helped to design and build the country's first cotton mill at Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Slater's workforce quickly grew from 9 workers to 100, and his mills multiplied. After that pioneering work, the pace of industrialization quickened, and in the mid-1810s and 1820s, especially in the production of textiles and shoes. The commitment to industrialization varied by region. Southern planters preferred to invest in land and slaves rather than machines. However, in contrast, New England's depleted soil stimulated investment in factories. Industrialization itself, though, was a gradual process with several distinct components. It usually always involved a reorganization of labor, with each worker fabricating only one part of the final product. Often, the industrial process also gathered workers into large factories. And finally, high-speed machines replaced skilled handiwork, and in some industries, these elements all occurred simultaneously. However, more often, they would happen one at a time and gradually over a number of years. Industrialization changed lives. Most workers in early factories were recruited from farms. Farming men and women had worked hard from sunrise to sunset, but they also were able to set their own pace and take periodic breaks. Factory workers, on the other hand, operated machines that ran continuously, and so encountered the new discipline of industrial time, regulated by clocks rather than tasks. Industrialization also encouraged a focus on more specialized production beyond the factories. A host of factors also stimulated industrialization. The Embargo Act of 1807, as I've mentioned before, prompted a lot of merchants who were barred from foreign trade to redirect their capital into the building of factories. Tariffs that were passed in the era of good feelings also protected America's fledgling industries from foreign competition. The natural environment in America also worked to its advantage because there were a large number, of cascading rivers, which were used to power the factory's machines. And the transportation revolution also opened up new markets for manufactured products in both the South and Western regions. Industrialization was also driven by problems within the rural economy. New England in the late 18th century had a population that had grown beyond the land's ability to support it. Farm families adopted new strategies to survive. For example, a farmer would decide to grow flax, which his wife and daughters could make into linen for sale. Or he would plant broom corn, and he and his sons would spend the winter months making brooms that he could then sell locally. In time, that same farmer might form a partnership to manufacture brooms on a larger scale and for more distant markets. And at some point, as that operation grew, the man would cease to be a farmer and begin purchasing his broom corn from other farmers, and with hired help, concentrate on the manufacturing process. Other merchants could then provide him with broom handles and twine, and would purchase and sell all the brooms that he could make. The comparatively high wages paid to unskilled laborers in the United States encouraged a lot of employers to replace them with machines. Because of Britain's head start in developing industrial technology, some American entrepreneurs simply copied the British designs. For example, one Francis Cabot Lowell charmed information about the British textile machinery out of his hosts on a visit to England, and he later engaged an American mechanic to construct the machines from drawings that he made each night in his hotel room. The U.S. benefited from the absence of craft organizations, referred to as guilds, in Britain, that often tied artisans to a single trade. In the absence of these guilds, American artisans freely experimented with machines outside of their own area of training. Americans also searched for new cost-cutting methods of production. For example, cotton gin inventor Eli Whitney won a government contract in 1798 to produce 10,000 muskets by 1800. Whitney planned to meet this almost impossible deadline by using unskilled workers to make interchangeable parts for the muskets. Whitney unfortunately promised much more than he could deliver and missed his deadline, but within a few decades, his idea of interchangeable parts would transform American manufacturing and even gain its own name, the American System. New England became America's first industrial region. The crisis in foreign trade that led to the War of 1812 also devastated the region's commercial economy and stimulated capital investment in manufacturing. New England's rivers were ideal sources for water-powered mills, and a surplus of young women supplied cheap industrial labor. Cotton textiles led the way in this manufacturing boom, with Boston merchants called the Boston Associates, including Francis Cabot Lowell, incorporating the Boston Manufacturing Company. They quickly built textile mills in the Massachusetts towns of Waltham and Lowell, and these mills were different, importantly so, in two ways from the earlier mills established by Samuel Slater in Rhode Island. Slater's mills performed only two of the operations needed to turn raw cotton into clothing: carding, which was separating the raw cotton from the fine strands, and spinning the strands into yarn. The weaving process, however, were contracted out to women who worked out of their home. In the Lowell mills, they were able to turn out finished fabrics by moving the weaving in-house rather than contracting it out. These mills served to upset the traditional family-based order of New England society. Slater tried to support traditional family structure not only by contracting the weaving to farm families, but also by hiring entire families to work in his mills. However, in the Waltham and Lowell mills, roughly 80% of the employees were young, unmarried women who had been lured from the farms by the promise of wages. In place of the traditional family discipline, the workers, or operatives, experienced new restraints. They had to live in either company boarding houses or in licensed private dwellings. They were required to attend church services on the Sabbath and observe a 10 p.m. curfew and comply with the company's moral regulations. These rules were designed to give the mills a good reputation so that New England farmers wouldn't hesitate to send their daughters to work there. Work conditions in the mill, however, were very poor. In order to provide the humidity necessary to keep the cotton threads from snapping, overseers would nail the factory windows shut and spray the air with water. The air was often quite filled also with cotton dust and the deafening roar of the machines. In the late 1830s, mill owners also reduced wages and sped up the work schedules. The major social groups that contributed to the system lived in separate worlds. The Boston Associates provided the capital but very rarely visited the factories. Their agents, who were all men, gave orders to the operatives, who were mostly women, which led to some contentious atmosphere within the mills. In fact, some 800 mill women at a Lowell mill quit their work in 1834 in order to protest a wage reduction. The Waltham and Lowell mills were much larger than most factories, However, the average industrial establishment employed only about 8 workers, as late as 1860. Outside of textiles, many industries continued to depend on industrial outwork. For example, in the 1830s, more than 50,000 New England farm women earned wages in their homes by making hats out of straw and palm leaves provided by merchant capitalists. New York City and Philadelphia also became industrial centers that depended on outwork. Some urban artisans and merchants also began to travel throughout the country in order to drum up orders for manufactured goods. They then hired unskilled workers, often women, to work in small shops or homes, fashioning parts of shoes or saddles or dresses. New York and Philadelphia were home to artisans with strong craft traditions who valued their independence, and those with highly marketable skills continued to earn good wages. A minority grew rich by turning themselves into businessmen. However, artisans lacking the capital to become businessmen found themselves on the downslide in the face of competition from cheap, unskilled labor. In the late 1820s, skilled male artisans in New York, Philadelphia, and other cities began to form trade unions and working men's political parties to protect their interests. Disdaining association with unskilled workers, most of the groups initially sought to restore privileges and working conditions that skilled artisans had once enjoyed. But a steady deterioration of working conditions demonstrated that skilled and unskilled workers were in the same boat. By 1835, in Philadelphia, the two groups had united to create the first general strike. Unskilled coal haulers struck for a 10-hour day in 1835, and skilled carpenters, shoemakers, and leather workers and other artisans quickly joined them. Many white Americans began to wonder whether their nation was truly a land of equality. The market and transportation revolutions were placing new pressures on the ideal of equality in America. The gap between the rich and the poor was widening in the first half of the 19th century. In cities, a small fraction of residents owned a huge share of the wealth. For example, in New York City, the richest 4% owned nearly half the wealth in 1828 and more than 2/3 of the wealth by 1845. Splendid residences, elite neighborhoods, and social clubs set the rich obviously apart. According to the popular myth of the self-made man, any man could choose to rise from rags to riches. But in reality, less than 5% of the wealthy had started life poor, and almost 90% were born rich. The usual way to acquire wealth was to inherit it and increase it by marrying well, and then expand it through wise investment. Occasional rags to riches stories, like that of John Jacob Astor and his fur trading empire, sustained the myth of rags to riches, but it remained mostly a myth. By today's standards, most antebellum Americans were poor. They lived very close to the edge of misery and depended largely on their children's labor just to meet expenses. But when antebellum Americans spoke of poverty, they were not thinking of what they saw as ordinary hardships. The greater specter which haunted them was the idea of pauperism, or severe economic dependency, which was created by any number of misfortunes. Epidemics of yellow fever or cholera could devastate families. A frozen canal or harbor could bring unemployment to boatmen and dock workers. A frozen river could force layoffs in factories that depended on water power. And even ordinary illnesses and old age, in the absence of things like health insurance and pensions, condemned many people to a life of pauperism. Middle-class moralists like to distinguish the deserving poor from the undeserving poor, and assigned indolent loafers and drunkards to the latter category, blaming their poverty on their own poor life choices. However, most moralists were comforted with the belief that pauperism would not pass from one generation to another. The deserving poor, they believed, were poor largely due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and could then also be overcome. This assumption was somewhat ill-founded, though. In reality, a class of people who could not escape poverty was emerging in major cities during the first half of the 19th century, and a major source of this entrenched poverty was immigration. The poorest white immigrants were from Ireland, where English landlords had been evicting peasants from the land in order to convert it for commercial use. Severed from the land, the Irish then became a nation of wanderers, with many of them congregating in the infamous Five Points district in New York City. The Five Points quickly emerged as one of the worst slums in America. The Irish were not only poor, but they were also Catholic, a faith that was despised by the Protestant majority in the United States pretty much since the founding. But even the Protestant poor came in for rough treatment in the years between 1815 and 1840. Middle-class Americans became increasingly convinced that success lay within everyone's grasp, and blamed the poor for being poor, and practiced discrimination that would keep some groups mired in enduring poverty. Northern free blacks, for example, were a major target of this form of discrimination. Racial prejudice against black Americans was deeply ingrained in white society throughout the nation. Although slavery had largely disappeared in the North by 1820, Northern whites passed laws to restrict black voting rights. Some laws even barred free blacks from migrating across city or state borders, and municipal ordinances often barred free blacks from using public conveyances and facilities, and either excluded them from public schools or forced them into segregated ones. Northern jails, almshouses, and hospitals also practiced racial segregation. Employment practices forced many free blacks into the least skilled and lowest paying occupations throughout northern cities. Although a few urban free blacks became successful entrepreneurs and achieved moderate wealth, as a group, they were only half as likely as city dwellers in general to own real estate. White churches also discriminated against free blacks by confining them to separate benches or galleries. A walkout from a Methodist church in Philadelphia prompted the formation of the first black-run Protestant denomination called the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The church had an active congregation in Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, New York, and throughout the mid-Atlantic states, and its members campaigned against slavery, boycotting produce grown by slaves. Just as Northern African Americans formed their own churches, they gradually also required some control over the education of their children. In the 1820s and 30s, an explosion of black self-help societies, like New York City's Phoenician Literary Society, was devoted to encouraging the education of black Americans. The majority of antebellum Americans lived neither in splendid wealth nor in grinding poverty, and most belonged to what men and women of the time called the middling classes. The standard of living rose between 1800 and 1860, particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades. Americans applied the term middling classes to families headed by professionals, by small merchants and manufacturers, by landowning farmers, and self-employed artisans. And commentators portrayed these people as living stable and secure lives. In reality, though, the middle often proved to be unpredictable. The commercializing economy created greater opportunities for both rising as well as falling on the social scale. And in the emerging market economy, occupational categories such as farmer and artisan often conveyed very little useful information about how someone actually made a living. For example, a gentleman called Asa Sheldon called himself a farmer in Massachusetts and offered advice on growing things like corn and cranberries and gave speeches about the glories of agriculture, but actually he spent very little time doing actual farm work. In 1812, he began transporting hops from New England breweries to New York City, and soon extended his business to Philadelphia and Baltimore. When a business setback forced him to sell his property, he was soon back in operation through the disinterested kindness of friends who lent him money. He used loans to purchase carts and oxen for a new company, but he never once gave up the title of farmer. The emerging market economy also transformed what it meant to be an artisan. During the colonial period, artisans formed a proud and cohesive group whose members often attained the goal of self-employment. They would own their own tools, make their own products, on order, especially from customers, and they would board their labor force of apprentices and journeymen in their homes. But by 1840, artisans had entered a new world of economic relationships, shaped not only by new industrial technology, but by the reorganization of production. For example, some carpenters, usually those with access to capital, became contractors, and they would take orders for more houses than they could build themselves, and so would hire a large number of journeymen to actually do the construction work. Excuse me. In effect, the older artisanal class was splitting into two new groups. Some became self-employed entrepreneurs, while others became wage-earning journeymen who would work for others. The middling classes experienced a very high degree of spatial mobility. The transportation revolution spurred many young men to enter the professions. And you see, frequently, new men crowded into fields like medicine and ministry and law who were forced into constant motion. Physicians would ride from town to town looking for patients. Itinerant clergymen would ride from town to visit the faithful or conduct revivals. And even well-established lawyers and judges spent part of each year riding from one county courthouse to another. Transients affected the lives of most Americans. Farmers not only exhausted their land by intensively cultivating cash crops and then moving on, but city dwellers also moved frequently as they would change jobs. Intense criticism of lawyers, physicians, and ministers also exemplified an assault on traditional authority, which was prominent in social ideas at the time. Some complained that lawyers would needlessly prolong and confuse court cases so that they could charge high fees. Some revivalists blasted the clergy for creating complicated theologies that ordinary men and women could not comprehend, with one revivalist extending the criticism to physicians, whom he accused of inventing Latin and Greek names for diseases to disguise their own ignorance of how to cure them. These jabs at the learned professions peaked between 1820 and 1850. Samuel Thompson, a farmer's son with very little formal education, led a successful movement to eliminate all barriers to entering the medical profession, including educational requirements. Meanwhile, relations between ministers and their parishioners started to grow contentious. In the 1830s, rapid turnover was becoming the norm, as parishioners grew far more willing to dismiss clergymen whose theology displeased them. Ministers themselves were becoming much more ambitious and more inclined to leave small, poor congregations for the larger, wealthier ones. Commercialization of the economy also increased both the numbers of professionals and the frequency of attacks on them. Newly minted lawyers and doctors seldom had deep roots in the towns that they served or convincing claims to social superiority. Westerners were particularly well known for questioning authority, and in a society where everyone was new, titles were easily adopted and just as easily challenged. In the West, neither law nor custom sanctioned claims to superiority. Would-be gentlemen substituted an exaggerated sense of personal honor. They were obsessed with their fragile status, and many reacted testily to the slightest insult, and dueling became a very widespread frontier practice. At the same time as adults were attacking the learned professions, children were also questioning parental authority. Young people were faced with a choice now between staying at home to help their parents or venturing out on their own. A similar desire for independence also tempted young men to leave home at an earlier age than in the past. And although the Great Migration to the West was primarily a movement of entire families, movement within regions, especially from farms to towns and cities, was frequently spearheaded by restless and single young people. Courtship patterns also changed as a result of this social revolution. Many young people who could no longer depend on their parents for land began to decide for themselves when and whom to marry. By the early 1800s, young men and women viewed romantic love as indispensable to a successful marriage. One sign of young people's increasing autonomy in courtship and marriage was the declining likelihood that daughters would marry in their exact birth order. As daughters began to make their own marital decisions, the practice ceased to be customary, and long engagements also became far more common, with some young women delaying tying the knot, fearing that marriage would snuff out their burgeoning independence. Moralists, alarmed by the signs that young people were living in a world of their own, flooded the country with advice books stressing the same message. Young men and women no longer subject to parental authority should develop self-control and that internalized system of government called character. The self-made adult, they instructed their readers, began with a self-made youth. Relations between spouses were also changing. Young men and women who grew accustomed to making decisions on their own were more likely than their ancestors to approach marriage as a partnership. Of course, wives remained unequal to their husbands in many ways, with a few exceptions. The law did not allow married women to own property. Divorce law tended to favor husbands. Battered women received no legal protection. But the allocation of power between husbands and wives within the marriage were shifting. One source of the change, which was zealously advocated by authors such as Catherine Beecher, was the doctrine of separate spheres. Traditionally, women had been viewed as subordinate to men in all spheres of life. But now middle-class men and women developed a kind of separate but equal doctrine for themselves. This portrayed men as being superior in making money and governing the world, and women as superior for their moral influence on family members. One of the most important duties assigned to women was the raising of children. And during the 18th century, church sermons emphasized the father's duty to govern the family. However, by the 1830s, child rearing manuals were addressed to mothers rather than fathers. Advice books instructed mothers to discipline misbehaving children through the withdrawal of affection rather than corporal punishment. The idea of women's sphere complemented the image of the home as a haven or refuge from society, and marked by a society that was marked by turmoil and disorder. Even the physical appearance of houses changed. Architect Andrew Jackson Downing published plans for cottage-like single-family homes that he hoped would offset the spirit of unrest and the feverish pace of American life. One of the motives that impelled later Americans to flee the cities for the suburbs was the desire to own their own homes. And in that instance, Downing deserves some credit as a kind of prophet, if you like. In the 1820s and 30s, this ideal was beyond the reach of most people. Although middle-class farmers still managed productive households, these were not necessarily tranquil. In the cities, middle-class families often had to sacrifice their privacy by taking in boarders in order to supplement family income, and so again, not very tranquil. Despite these distortions, the doctrine of separate spheres and the image of the home as refuge illuminated new domestic arrangements in the antebellum period. The rising number of urban families headed by lawyers and merchants gave mothers time to spend on child rearing. Most important, married women found that they could capitalize on these notions to gain new power within their families. A subtle implication of the doctrine of separate spheres was that women should wield control, not only over child rearing, but also over family planning, which was, of course, the determination of how many children they would have. In 1800, the United States had one of the highest birth rates ever recorded, with the average American woman having roughly 7 children. In the pre-industrial farming economy, married women tended to become pregnant as often as possible because children carried out essential tasks in the household economy. But the spread of commercial economy raised serious questions about the economic value of children, so that by 1850 the average woman was bearing only about 5 children. And by 1900, that number had dipped to roughly 3. For the most part, the decline in the birth rate was accomplished by abstinence from sexual intercourse or abortion. And by the late 1840s, abortionists were advertising remedies for female irregularities, a common euphemism for unwanted pregnancy. There were no birth control devices that were foolproof, and there was a lot of misinformation circulated about birth control techniques. However, interest in devices was intensifying. In 1832, Dr. Charles Knowlton of Massachusetts described the procedure for vaginal douching in his book, The Fruits of Philosophy. And although he was repeatedly prosecuted and even jailed for obscenity, efforts to suppress his ideas succeeded only in generating further publicity for them. By 1865, popular tracts had familiarized Americans with a wide range of birth control methods, including the condom and the diaphragm. The decision to limit family size was usually reached jointly by husbands and wives. Supporters of the ideal of separate spheres did not advocate legal equality for women. Indeed, the ideal of separate spheres was an explicit alternative to legal equality. However, in addition to enhancing a woman's power within the marriage, separate spheres also allowed some women a measure of independence from the home. As some forms of hierarchical authority, like traditional marriages, as well as political and professional, were weakening, Americans started to devise new ways for individuals to extend their influence over others. This period witnessed the widespread substitution of horizontal allegiances for vertical allegiances. In a vertical allegiance, authority flows from the top down and from social superiors to their subordinates. Subordinates identify their interests with those of their superiors rather than the people around them who occupy the same subordinate role. The traditional patriarchal family is a perfect example of this. Although vertical relationships did not disappear, you start to see more and more horizontal relationships coming into play. Increasingly, relationships are more likely to be marked by this type of bonding, bringing together people who occupy the same social position. Maternal and debating societies, for example, exemplified the American zeal for voluntary associations, or associations that arose apart from the government and sought to accomplish some kind of shared goal. Voluntary associations also encouraged a certain amount of sociability. As transients and newcomers flocked into towns and cities, they sought out others with similar characteristics, experiences, or interests. Gender was the basis for a lot of voluntary associations, with race being yet another basis. Voluntary associations also enhanced their members' public influence. Men and women would join in temperance societies, for example, to promote voluntary abstinence, and moral reform societies also tended to enhance women's power over men. Here, as elsewhere, the tendency of the times was to forge new forms of horizontal allegiance between like-minded Americans.